So how was Disney's TVMA rated horror show? Episode 8, the season finale. Last episode, Deep Dive, we were talking about how there was a lot of setup, and now we're here to discuss the payoff. Was the build worth it? Full spoilers for season 1 of Alien Earth ahead. Starting off with those plot moments. One thing this show sort of promised was continuity within the Alien franchise, which is a thing I don't care about at all, but I do see continually referenced and concerned about, so I sort of want to present my argument for why we shouldn't care. If you're just using the movies for continuity's sake, then it makes perfect sense to me that no one would ever talk about the Prodigy Corporation because they're not involved in any of the movies. And while the movies have some aspects of synths in it, they never reference cyborgs or synth-human hybrids, so whether or not that's a technology that exists or successful in that time period doesn't really matter. So for me, there's still infinite possibility in how this TV show ends. In fact, if we ended up with all the aliens still existing on Neverland Island, or the synths being out there in space, or just living here on this island, or living self-contained lives in Prodigy territory, or even traveling across the Earth but being undercover and just sort of passing as human, all of that is open storytelling-wise as an ending, and to me, it wouldn't break continuity at all because it's not something we'd have discussed in these previous movies. Heck, if these aliens are still alive in Neverland Island while we're watching the events of Alien proper take place, in some ways there's this extra tension that I find really interesting because a major plot point of Alien 1, 2, and 3 and 4 Resurrection is that we don't want these aliens to get to Earth. We're terrified of what that outcome is. So the idea that we're struggling and feeling massive stakes for that when actually the aliens are already on Earth and living in the island is sort of funny to me. And it's an extra layer of cruelty because the companies are probably aware these aliens are on the island, or at least Whalen Yutani would be aware of that. And they're still throwing all of these people at the aliens infinitely disposable resource to get them, even though they've had these aliens on Earth all this time and presumably there's not any technology based off of it right now. The promised aliens on Earth massacre, specifically with the xenomorphs wrecking shit. So I would say that this premise was delayed and arguably had to be delayed if we were going to maintain continuity, which I think is boring as all fuck. But even when we knew it wasn't going to be the entirety of Earth, I did think we were going to get to see some more mayhem on the island than we really got, especially because the titular xenomorph is really not a threat and not that scary in this series. Mostly it's the other aliens that we're concerned about rolling me into the mayhem on the island, which I feel we didn't really get. Yes, the xenomorph kills a bunch of generic troop folks at Wendy's command, but the fact that the alien is contained and commanded to do these things takes away some of the horror. Also, the fact that it's just a bunch of faceless troops is not as scary or as investing as we got in those original Alien movies with the small crafted crew. You know, the fact that the ending has all of these adults who groomed and manipulated children locked up and the synth kids and the aliens outside doing a happy freedom dance is uplifting and triumphant. It's not scary. And the fact that we didn't lose any of the major evil characters and we didn't lose any of the major good characters also just feels like a de-escalation of stakes and the promised horror narrative. I was sort of surprised by this outcome because I didn't imagine the kids were going to be actually capable enough to pull this off on their own. I thought the lines wouldn't be quite so clearly delineated, but from a horror narrative, from what the show promised sort of perspective, I don't feel this is necessarily a good thing, especially because nobody dies or is seriously injured to make this happen. Which kind of rolls me into the Wendy and Hermit face-off. The thing I was really kind of looking forward to was set up very highly in episode 7 and again is deferred to maybe a future season. And Smee gets a moment where he comes up and insists that no matter what Hermit did to Nibs, he's one of them and they should protect and include him as part of their rank. Which I love this moment from Smee and think it is a great payoff for everything we've seen from his character and makes him kind of matter and more interesting to me down the line. But as far as this set up discussion point that we needed to have between Wendy and Hermit, we sort of just kicked the can down the road in a way that was unengaging. They kind of sort of have a little bit of that argument when they're face to face again and they, are able to get rid of the eyeball for a minute, where Hermit sort of explains that Nibs was threatening his unit and he was afraid for them, so that's why he shot her. But obviously Wendy already knew all that information. Hermit should be aware that Wendy's kind of sensitive about her being being synthetic. So she's gonna see this like him choosing pure humanity over synthetics and possibly even a rejection of her personhood. And Hermit does nothing to clarify this point. It would be easy for him to say that in the heat of the moment he chose what he was trained to choose, his truth. Or it would be easy for him to talk about how shocking Nibs didn't kill Nibs, but what Nibs was doing was lethal for his unit, so he was looking to preserve the most lives possible and sort of sort out sides later. Like he could have pleaded to his profession as a medic here. And instead we get this like weird convoluted speech about power from Wendy and like weak people giving thoughts and prayers basically and saying it's too complicated to really do anything, which I suppose is an interesting point when you're talking about somebody who's in power and could actually do something. But like in Hermit's case, he's caught up in a moment there. He made a snap judgment decision, something that he was like trained to do. I don't think it's like the hook to hang his personality on. So while Wendy's interpretation of events is fair and Hermit has done nothing to dissuade her, I don't think it's accurate. And I just think that they left this conflict around so that we could do something more with it in season 2, but I don't find this an interesting conflict. I wish we'd just squashed this beef. I wish we hadn't even introduced it, if I'm gonna be really honest with you. But now that it is here, we should have done more of it in episode 8 and like finalized it. I expected there to be a bunch of deaths in this finale, and I'm disappointed to say that's only sort of what happened. There are a lot of faceless soldier deaths here, but I needed some injury, maiming, death, threat of loss of life to our main characters, and we really didn't get that. From that specific angle, this is like a huge letdown to me. I really wanted some of the lost kids to bite the dust. The scenario as it was set up felt like none of these characters would be seriously harmed, and to me that like removed a lot of tension, it removed a lot of stakes, and it made this finale a lot less interesting than it could have been. They promised me they'd put this eyeball in a human body, which happens, but it happens so far into the episode that we don't really get to see if the eyeball maintains any memories from the human host, if the eyeball can talk now, because obviously he understands English, so it stands to reason he should be able to speak it or learn to speak it once he has, you know, all the right parts to do so. It sucks because I'm really curious about this eyeball alien. I think he's a fan favorite. We all really want to know more about his motives and backstory. Which kind of moves me into the aliens overall and talking specifically about this eyeball creature. The storyline here goes nowhere and is so anticlimactic. I know it's setting us up for season 2, but we don't even know if a season 2 is going to happen just yet. Also, putting him in Arthur's corpse is like too many variables at play for me. It really begs the question about this creature's parasitic nature. Like, does it kill the sentience of whatever it takes over? Because like removing an eye from your head doesn't kill a person. So in theory, you are still alive while the eyeball is puppeting you, unless like when he attaches all his little tentacles up in your brain, kills whatever makes you sentient, like whatever area of the brain that is hosting you he destroys. Or I guess he could just lock that off so that he could have control, or it could be like a perpetual fight for control. These are like parts that we'd have gotten a little bit more insight to if we'd gotten more time with the eyeball in a living person that we're not going to get in a dead person. But that also makes me really curious about the eyeball's parasitic nature as a whole, because after you die, your brain no longer gets oxygen, right? And those cells start to die off rapidly, which means that like the eyeball went into something that was brain damaged, and perhaps it shouldn't be able to control the human form so well anymore. Like if the eyeball is using the brain like a control center for the body, that it's just like pulling levers and puppeting to make it move. If the levers are broken, he can't do that anymore. Also, I don't know like what parts of the brain atrophy first. Like, is this just memories that are damaged? Could the eyeball have ever accessed those memories at all? Or is it like the basic mechanics that are damaged? Is it all damaged at the same rate? Like, these are real questions, extra variables that sort of like make me less excited about Arthur now being the eyeball monster puppet. And of course, personally, I'm just so disappointed that we didn't use Isaac's synth body in this way, because like a synth body would be so hard to destroy. It would have made the eyeball like very Machiavellian, very hard to get rid of, a real and true antagonist. And I also would have got to see like some shade of Isaac back on the show. Plus the fact that the flies got into his face and made that eyeball aspect so prominent in him would have had purpose. And I'm all about like those foreshadowing hints paying off on the other end of things. Which brings me to the depiction of the Xenomorph, which we've kind of like downplayed from a major antagonistic force in danger into a glorified attack dog for Wendy. The relationship itself intrigues me, but making the Xenomorph less scary, more controllable is not something that I necessarily love about the show as a whole. And I was wrong, we do get to see a kill by the flower, which was kind of cool. It's like this big thing that can move really fast, which who'd have thought that? But I really wish that we had held off on seeing the flower kill someone to the potential season 2, because then we could have had more like slow reveals, discovery with what the flower does, how dangerous it is, and that could have built more tension and stakes for the eventual kill. Like for example, the ticks got a fairly long introduction starting on the spaceship with them eating the rats, like the slow discovery of what they can do, that they have larger goals to escape and propagate. All that kind of stuff creates this build and sense of stakes and concern and gives us a chance of like feeling that uncertain worry about what's going to happen and how exactly that's going to play out that you don't get with this flower. Even Isaac's kill with the flies has way more setup and payoff going on, because we open that episode seeing these metal nests that they're making. We get to see the inorganic food that Isaac intends to feed the things, and then we see him mess with the door, decide to go in there to drop off the food, leading to his death. An observant viewer knows before Isaac's attacked that those flies can harm him, and that creates like a fear and tension within the audience when you put Isaac into a vulnerable situation that we don't otherwise get. The flower just gets to be out of containment and it just gets to chomp that one soldier. It really doesn't have that kind of like horror moment to it. Which rolls me into the characters. I haven't been treating Boyd Cavalier like a character, but we get enough backstory here where I think we might actually have to start doing that. He'd been kind of like a chaos gremlin with no motives or feelings that I could observe. But then we learned that he actually was a brilliant child who created a synth that he designed specifically to kill his abusive father, take over the role of father, and be like a figurehead while he gets to run a company in secret as a kid. All of that explains so much about what's going on in this show. I mean, having a kid that's already kind of disturbed now have free reign, not be forced to consider empathy, to interact or engage with anything they don't want to, starting at 6 is pretty intense just as a backstory. But then the fact that he like surrounds himself with synths, the lawyer guy turns out to be a surprise synth, and Kirsch has been a synth this whole time. These are the only people who have input he considers. You know, it's a complete devaluing of humanity. It makes sense to me that his next step is to put humans into synths and then be able to control those synths and those inputs like more thoroughly than he can even with these human subservient people around him who are too afraid to say no to this crazy man. And the fact that he's created this culture where people cannot give him feedback, cannot say no or critique his ideas, is what makes him so bored in conversations, and also kind of what is driving him to create these synthetic children. And the fact that he kind of peaked when he was 6. Like, the most brilliant thing that he did on his own happened at 6 years old when he made a synth by himself, one that was able to kill his father and is also able to like pose as a human seamlessly. As far as I can tell, he hasn't done anything worthwhile since then. He's just kind of been playing around with money and Legos and whatever. Makes sense that he would want to put kids in synth bodies and capture that whatever ineffable something that made him so smart and resilient at 6 that he's never been able to talk since then. Which brings me to Kirsch. This guy is infinitely less interesting this episode and probably going forward for me. He had been giving such excellent secret main character energy. I was so captivated. But I think he's just a loyal synth, and that really sucks. You know, between the lawyer and Kirsch, it seems like the lawyer synth guy actually has way more agency than Kirsch does. So while the lawyer's like picking out the person who's gonna be sacrificed to the eyeball, and he's like protecting Boyd from all these secret things and like getting ready to tell him I told you so about the failure of the Lost Boys, Kirsch is just sitting in the lab doing day-to-day routines, preparing stuff, which to me seem to indicate that he hasn't been scheming this whole time. He really is just sort of like a lifeless robot doing his day-to-day routine in the way he's programmed to do it, which is to like take care of things without involving Boyd because Boyd doesn't want to be bogged down with these details and boring things. You kind of tricked me with the character this season, show, but I see it now. I won't be caught up again. Rolling me into Morrow, he's finally become kind of interesting to me as a character. You know, previously we've seen him very much as like a company man, very dedicated to Weyland-Yutani. He has some minimal areas of conflict there, but he has one specific line when he's in the cell with Hermit where he asks about the artificial lung and talks a little bit about his arm that sort of suggests that this is the beginning of the end. The company owns you more than everything about you, more than all of your labor or whatever. They own you in a way that's so thorough, and he's so unable to, you know, separate himself from. He's become like this unrecognizable monster, and that's the only way forward for him. It suggests like suffering and unhappiness with this role he plays, as well as like his ability to warn others about the trap that is whatever the company offers them. That makes him a more interesting character and gives him more potential for season 2. That also rolls me into Hermit. I think I said in episode 6 that I don't know who Hermit is or what his character and motivations are, and I think we find out the core of who and what Hermit is supposed to be here in the 8th episode. When both he and the cyborg get to escape, and the cyborg is obviously going after the aliens and torching the place, Hermit says to him that he's gonna save as many as he can. And I think that's who Hermit is at heart. He's someone who wants to save as many people as possible. Whether they're good guys or bad guys, he just values life and the preservation of it. He does see these synth kids as a form of life, but he treats them differently because their capability and spectrum is different. It is interesting to me that the guy who's the medic who wants to take care of people, preserve life on both sides, has no love for the aliens. I do wonder a little bit about what that implies thematically, especially because he can bridge the gap for synths and he can bridge the gap for cyborgs, but he does not bridge the gap for the aliens, possibly because they kill and eat people. Maybe they're not human looking enough for him to like empathize with. But I do feel like I finally have a beat on who Hermit is, how he's going to respond to things going forward if we get a season 2. Which rolls me into Wendy. We do get closure for her episode 6 introduction that she has to grow up via the voiceover about Peter Pan that goes on. I do get that she's the main character and that's why she gets to be the leader of the Lost Boys, but I think for the synth kids to really reclaim who they are and take their personhood and autonomy away from Prodigy, they're gonna have to find their own roles within the group, and that might mean that Wendy is not really the leader of this Lost Boys group. Arc-wise, I think more than growing up, the kids need to each find their own place and structure within their group and like what they do or don't do, what their interests are. And we're just not there with them yet, but I think it's interesting that the group still rallies around Wendy, acknowledges her as a leader. Even Jane/Curly lets her have that accolade after expressing displeasure with her own placement and wanting to be the leader. Which brings me to each one of the Lost Boys. There's still possibility for Nibs to get her own personhood, I think. We get a little bit more on her really caring about her own autonomy, her memories, what she still can do and remember, and like her viciously defending that. And I think there might be a potential storyline for her going forward about whether or not they reinstall the original personality or maintain her as she is now. With Jane/Curly, nothing much happens here. She reaffirms that she's connected to the Lost Boys and is loyal to them over any other exterior force, which she kind of already did when she insisted she wouldn't tell anyone about them escaping. The kids accuse her of being the one who tells on them, but she didn't do that. So really it's more about her character maintaining consistency here and maybe us again kicking the can about leadership down the road into season 2. With Slightly, I really feel like his arc was complete in episode 7. Since he survived, there is a lot of ways his arc could go in a season 2. The most interesting of them for me is going to involve his relationship with Smee. Realistically, I've got nothing to say about his participation in this season finale. And that rolls me into Smee, who character-wise is the biggest surprise and delight here at the episode finale. I found him really annoying and boring in all of his small cameos to this point, but it pays off really well when he gets this one-on-one moment with Wendy and reaffirms like unity and family and loyalty in this kind of way. And it sort of suggests to me that Smee is very much the beating heart of the Lost Boys, the last remnant that connects them to humanity and innocence and joy and like the best things there is in being a child and being a human, period. Rolling me into the themes, starting with human immortality. You might have guessed by the way I covered this that it doesn't exactly interest me personally. The current world we see in Alien Earth is so fractured and disjointed, and there's so much more human suffering, it seems like, in that world than we have even in ours today, that I'm kind of like, why would you even want to live forever? Don't get me wrong, it is fitting that trillionaires are investing all their money in human immortality. As it stands now, billionaires have more money than they can ever spend or reinvest, and they're not spending it. Dumping your money into a pit that might one day grant you immortality kind of makes sense for trillionaires. Like, their lives are great, why not go ahead and make it extend forever in sort of like a monotony and boredom kind of way? And them becoming immortal is like the last step between them separating themselves from humanity and into like some kind of ruling godhood situation, which to me is another like indication that humanity and immortality are just not compatible elements. If you're human, inherently you have some level of mortality being in your body. And if you're immortal, you're divorced from the decay of your body in a way that means you're outside of the human experience, outside of that connectivity we have to each other as like a social species. The show has done a great job showing humanity as monstrous to this point. In fact, this finale episode, Monster, seems to be referring to the humans and not the aliens. But it's also giving us kind of like our first glimmer of hope for humanity via Smee, because he is a child that went through this cruel, manipulative synth process, and he also was sent to the alien crash site, and it seems like he still gets to maintain a sense of his humanity and dignity. Of all the children, he feels the least changed by these events. Meanwhile, we have Wendy, who originally started off as like our confident, hopeful, focal character leader, who was originally loudly and consistently affirming that she was a continuation of that cancer-ridden child, now kind of rejecting the premise that the synth children are still children or a continuation of their own line. She's rejecting any sense or connectivity she originally had to humanity. And I get why Wendy made this choice, because the only good human being we've seen to this point is Hermit, and in episode 7 we watch Hermit shoot nibs. So for Wendy, that's got to be a major breaking point. Like, the best person she knows still doesn't see these kids as children. The best person she knows, the last bit of humanity she loves and connects with, will turn on her if it becomes a her versus organic beings moment. In a lot of ways, it is safer for Wendy to view herself as not human, which rolls me into the scorpion analogy. It does seem like I was correct in the last deep dive where I called out Wendy as potentially being the scorpion. Who she ends up stinging isn't Hermit, but is actually Boyd Cavalier. It's a situation where, as the head of Prodigy, she sees him hurting and manipulating Nib. She sees him as allowing Isaac's death. She sees him as like rounding up all of her friends and family and locking them in a cage. It really kind of forces her hand to turn on him and fight back if she wants any sense of autonomy, freedom, or safety for her friends at all. That said, with Boyd, Dame Sylvia, Morrow, Kirsch, all in this very circular sort of see-through kind of cage, it does visually appear like they are now the scorpions in the glass, and it's sort of setting up a potential for some kind of turnaround, or setting up a potential for the synth kids to show that they've learned the lesson about killing the scorpion. It is a little bit of a hard sell because none of these characters have any friends, so the idea that Kirsch set up in the beginning, what if I go to kill this scorpion and one of his friends sees me doing him harm and stings me in retaliation, is just not a setup that we can do with these more nefarious characters. But I'll be interested to see where this analogy goes, if anywhere at all, in season 2. Also rolling me into the synths as ghosts, which is an idea that we introduce just in this episode and execute in a way that I kind of love. Like, Wendy transforming Neverland into a haunted house is just fucking awesome. I like that the kids are facing their own mortality, the fact that they were killed, and what remains here in their synth bodies are just ghosts. And originally that makes them sad to think of their own death. That makes them sad to think that they're creatures that no longer have impact or place in the living mortal coil. But then Wendy turns around and says, what do ghosts do? And all the kids get like this kind of like knowing smile on their face, because ghosts get revenge. Ghosts haunt people who have harmed them. Ghosts do scary and unpredictable things. Arguably because we don't know the rules of the supernatural, ghosts have infinite potential to do anything and everything they can imagine. And the point here is that ghosts still have an impact on the living. A ghost in a story is often a manifestation of guilt, or it's a literary device that shows one's wrongs are following a person and eventually going to catch up to them and give them some kind of vengeance or comeuppance. A ghost is often a way in literature that we depict how disenfranchised people can get their vengeance on powerful people who have done them wrong. And you know, part of the reason we do that is because the only way we can imagine these disenfranchised people getting any kind of vengeance or justice is through some sort of supernatural intervention like a ghost. So the fact that Boyd Cavalier, as the powerful person, is the one who creates his own ghosts, and that on some level it's not like a supernatural intervention for the sake of the disenfranchised people, but it's the disenfranchised people picking up their own power and finding their voice and rising up against the powerful. It's the kind of story that is 100% my thing, and I love that in this last episode we injected a little bit of that gothic horror and ended it in like a traditionally gothic triumphant sort of note. Capitalism and corporations as the major evil driving force. So the synth kids are overthrowing the order in the Prodigy Company in a way that's very reminiscent to me of Snowpiercer Season 1, how the Tail does a bloody revolution and overthrows First Class. But unlike Snowpiercer, where the Tail has all these ideas of alternative government and formats that they'd like to see put in place on Snowpiercer, these kids don't really know what the next step is. And it doesn't really matter in either of these stories, because in Snowpiercer Season 1, immediately Wilfred catches up to them and we transition into a show that's about Snowpiercer original resisting or deciding to join with Wilfred. And I think in Alien Earth, it also is not going to matter that these kids don't know what to do with the revolution, because Weyland Yutani is coming to invade the island, and I think that's going to be the next major threat that distracts them from figuring themselves out. But unlike in Snowpiercer, where I considered using Wilfred this way to be sort of like a lack of creativity because the show didn't know how to go into a political thriller drama about us reshaping society. There is a larger world in Alien Earth that the kids would have to contend with. There are corporate sharks circling Prodigy all the time, so even if you're able to get control of one company the way the kids do, you also have to like maintain the defense and the infrastructure in such a way that you can keep control and keep those resources away from everyone else in the corporation, which would not necessarily have been an issue Snowpiercer had to face if they hadn't brought Wilfred back into the picture. So I think naturally what this story might want to explore about capitalism and exterior forces that influence a harsh government system might have more validity or like more room for me to like hear them out. And then just like a closing note about the portrayal of systematic oppression here in Alien Earth. In episode 3, I asserted that Boyd Cavalier is posing as like a plantation owner slash like technology bro kind of guy, and that this wasn't just an observation I had made, but it was intentional on the show's part. And the turning point for me is the arbitration scene we get in episode 5 or 6. And I think it's only appropriate after the couple of reveals we get here at episode 8 that we revisit this narrative and see if I still hold the same opinion. Does learning that this lawyer guy is actually a synth Boyd created change things? If we go back to that pivotal scene where the two companies are arbitrating, and visually we've got like the white middle-aged guy being the neutral third party against a more diverse looking Yutani and 3 white guys over here in the Prodigy side. Just changing it from 3 white guys over to 1 white guy and 2 synths change anything? And I guess I have to ask, does anyone in that scene beside Boyd know that he's 1 man and 2 synths? Or does everyone else think like the audience originally does, that the lawyer is a human being? I do think in world, the characters are still responding to the same optics and power structures that I originally outlined in that episode 6 review. Now, for me as an audience member with this added knowledge, does that change how I view the scene? And I think the answer is yes. but maybe not how you would like it to change things. Because I think it actually adds more nuance in some ways, better showing how systematic oppression and structures are built to self-sustain. Because Boyd Cavalier here has literally built the structures that allow him to self-sustain that power and oppression he already has. You don't need 3 white guys to take over, you only need 1 with the system as it stands. And this sort of like connects with my own personal experience being socialized as a woman and sort of being taught to be wary of being isolated with men. It's not because all men are dangerous. In fact, most men are perfectly pleasant, wonderful people, right? But you only need 1 bad guy to go around and mess things up and make you concerned for your own safety. That 1 bad dude uses the current inequality in power structures to either force their victim into silence or to shame and defame that person should they attempt to bring charges to a court of law. Boyd Cavalier's use of a synth posing as his father to help him get away with murder as a child and then corporate takeover sort of like embodies this in a very direct one-to-one way. And I want to give credit where credit is due. Originally I said Boyd Cavalier couldn't or wouldn't do anything at all, and it does seem like he did have some talent. He did build a synth at 6 years old that so much mimics a human he was able to pass as this kid's father after murdering his real dad. That does show some talent and a certain set of ruthlessness and ability to manipulate that, you know, is necessary for the job role he has. On the flip side though, synths were already a thing that existed when Boyd Cavalier made this one. He's not an innovator. The parts for the synth were so commonplace, he was able to like somehow scrap them all together at 6, you know? Also, I would say being able to build a synth is not the same thing as being able to take a human consciousness and put it into a synth, so I would still argue he probably still has little to no expertise in what's going on in his company now. He certainly doesn't seem to know anything about aliens or biological research. One aspect of Boyd's personality that does kind of come full circle in this episode is a wardrobe change to like oversized sweaters and like a green element that sort of upplays his childlike qualities and perhaps reinforces the mythos he keeps telling us about how he's Peter Pan. Especially in scenes here where he's like skip running along like he's playing a game when his own synthetic creations are like hunting him down, supposedly to kill him. Like he's having a good time with this level of vicious play in a way that's very Peter Pan coded. And I think this does bring us to exploring the similarities between Peter Pan and Captain Hook that are in the book, because both Peter Pan and Captain Hook are cruel, heartless creatures. Like, Pan is not nice to his lost boys in the story. He does not show empathy for anyone. He's more than willing to sacrifice people, even himself, in this fight he has going on with Captain Hook. And Captain Hook is much the same way. He doesn't care about his pirate crew or anything like that either. And both Peter Pan and Captain Hook seem to be equally matched, which is why they're perpetually in this back and forth battle. It is interesting to note that Captain Hook only exists as like a way to distract you when the play is changing scenery. Like originally, Peter Pan is the villain and the main character all in one. So Wendy like recognizing Boyd Cavalier not as Peter Pan but Captain Hook is kind of connecting for us that were Peter Pan ever to grow up, he would become Captain Hook. Like they are one and the same. And I think this is important storyline wise because the synth kids have the same potentiality. And I think storyline wise it's important to re-highlight how cruel and awful Peter Pan is, because a lot of times we dismiss in children when they behave badly. And that's fair, right? Like children need to learn empathy, they need to learn to be taught to think about other people, they need to come to understand that how they're acting is cruel or thoughtless. A lot of kids grow out of that. It just so happens that Boyd Cavalier didn't have anyone to parent him. And perhaps he had a disturbed personality from the start and would always have come to be this. Now he sort of like bestowed that same kind of manipulation and violence onto these other children that are in the synth bodies, and they have the potentiality to change into more cruel, like Captain Hook sort of scenario instead of like the whimsy, hopeful Peter Pan that's been Disneyfied. But it's also kind of worth pointing out that Wendy's depiction of Boyd as always being an adult is flawed. I really think he was the Peter Pan child transformed into Captain Hook as he aged. And Wendy, like, not understanding that this guy was not always an adult is setting her up to fall into the same kind of Peter Pan never grow up kind of trap, Peter Pan is good sort of thing that Boyd himself like believes about his own self mythology. And maybe some of y'all are sitting here thinking, like, if there's a clear one-to-one connection with Peter Pan and Captain Hook for Boyd Cavalier within this metaphor, how does that fit into like the capitalism is bad, potentially being a stand-in for a tech bro kind of element? And the way I see it, Boyd Cavalier is the one who is spreading and telling us this Peter Pan mythos about himself. It's not about how he's framed in the larger world of Alien Earth, it's about who he wants to be, the story he wants to tell about himself. And we're getting it very strongly because he's reading this story to the kids and because the kids are like regurgitating it back to us as an audience member. But we have more than just the synth children and Boyd Cavalier as tellers of this story of Alien Earth. So we can both look at his comparison here, see all of the unintended similarities and connections we can make to him as Peter Pan and how that's not actually as good as Boyd Cavalier thinks, and also see his placemat and formatting for what it is in Alien Earth as a larger story. And you know, I've already outlined in season 3 all of the different tells I think the larger encapsulation of the story is throwing at us to suggest Boyd is like this greater evil. He is the embodiment of the capitalism and the corporation that we want to fight. But that's really all I've got for Alien Season 1, and I guess a little taste of predictions I have for what could go on in Season 2 if we get it. There's a lot of theming and imagery I really adored in this season and think is highly accurate to the spirit of the Alien franchise, but I do think it spent a long time setting up things it doesn't deliver and stumbling in the horror element specifically. This is perhaps one of my lesser favorite uses of the xenomorphs, though at least it's portraying something different and unique to itself. But talk to me in those comments down below. What did you think of Alien Earth? Or drop an island emoji in those comments down below. As always, keep reading.